Improving trout habitat. That's the goal behind a partnership between the Fish and Wildlife Department and Trout Unlimited.
Two guys from Trout Unlimited.
Trout Unlimited.
Trout Unlimited.
My friends at Trout Unlimited.
Trout Unlimited.
Trout Unlimited.
Teaching veterans the fine art of fly fishing, free of charge and equipment included.
Conservation is the most forward-looking and optimistic idea that America ever gave the rest of the world.
But the other thing we have in common is fishing with our sons in Montana.
Yes.
Tell me about your experience.
So my son is right into fish. He knows every variety of fish. He's 14, just turned 14. And I surprised him by saying we're going on a father-son trip to Montana.
What part did you go?
Missoula. We flew into Missoula. Great part of the world.
Yeah, lovely.
Tom Reed and Corey, two guys from Trout Unlimited. Fantastic. They picked us up and they took us an hour and a half out and we fished and fly fished.
What real deal are we talking about?
There are two kinds of people in this world. Selfish, self-centered, ham-hoarding people like Aaron here, and kind, thoughtful, generous people who are members of Trout Unlimited.
There are two reasons that we punch as above our weight as we do, and I will very quickly share what they are with you. Number one, the phenomenal volunteers that we have at TU. The next two slides speak for themselves, but this represents the growth of our grassroots operation over the past 5 years, and this next slide shows the growth of the national organization over the past 5 years. Again, I think this speaks to why people invest in Trout Unlimited, because we do a lot of good work on the ground, and we're going to cover some of that ground this morning. Frank Weisbarth wrote a wonderful book called Holy Ghost Creek. And if Aldo Leopold had written a book on fishing, that is the book he would have written. And so I know he's got copies here. I highly commend it to you all. I'm getting a cut on every sale of every book he makes at this annual meeting, so I personally would appreciate it if you buy it. But honestly, it's one of the best fishing books I've ever read. Anyway, Frank's going to be my spiritual guide through this journey here. And I want to read something that he wrote in Holy Ghost Creek. He says, "Most of what goes on in the natural world passes unnoticed except to those who care. In order to observe wild things, you must care about them. The kind of watching that a fisherman does is not abstract. He is seeking a tangible connection with the fish, a connection with its life through the gossamer thread of the line that binds them to each other. When the last hunter or fisherman passes from the scene, a large segment of the natural world will pass from human sight. There will be no one left with the desire to see it, and no one left with eyes that can see." Our connection to wild and native fish is not abstract. And the passion that we have for the places that those fish are found is real. And it's grounded in countless hours spent in the field or on the water in patient and quiet observation. But don't get me wrong, this isn't some dispassionate, Zen-like observation. It drives action. It is remarkable to consider that in 2008, we'd set out on a path to try to double the size and the sweep of what we could accomplish as an organization. And through one of the most financially troubled and tumultuous periods in the country's history, we did that. We doubled the size of Trout Unlimited. We raised $175 million that we apply on the ground for trout and salmon conservation. The fact is that money flows to things that people want, and people like what we do. We are very good at what we do. We do very few things, but we do them very, very well. So what I want to do today is, since we're just finishing a strategic plan, we're embarking on a new plan, we just finished a campaign where we raised $175 million, I want to talk a little bit about some of the values that help drive who we are as an organization and how we accomplish what we do. You know, it's almost an old-fashioned idea, this notion of being mission-driven. It's almost quaint. But the fact is, that's who we are and that's what we do. As I said earlier, we focus on very few things and we do them very, very well. A great example of that is our work in Bristol Bay. We've been talking about Bristol Bay for many years. It's been our highest conservation priority, protecting that landscape from industrial-scale mining for about 8 years now. Well, I'm pleased to say over the past year we made significant progress to that end. The EPA concluded its second peer review of the potential effects of industrial-scale mining on that watershed, and they initiated the process through the Clean Water Act that we asked for that I am confident this year will lead finally to the protection of Bristol Bay and the remarkable salmon fisheries that it possesses. On a smaller scale, but equally significant, in Wyoming over the past 5 or 6 years, we've done great work helping to reconnect tributaries, spawning and rearing tributaries to larger rivers. This year was no exception. On the Gros Ventre River, we removed the Kelly Dam, which for 100 years had blocked habitat for over 100 miles of spawning and rearing habitat. The Klamath is another river system that we've talked about for years. In the past, we accomplished 2 agreements. The first, notably, was an agreement to take out the 4 dams that block 450 miles of historic salmon and steelhead habitat. The second was an agreement to conduct restoration on those lands once the dams were out. This year we reached a third agreement, introduction of legislation that will lead to the removal of those dams over time and the restoration of that river system. And that third agreement was with landowners on the Sprague, Williamson, and Wood rivers that will equally benefit from that restoration. Looking to the east on the Chesapeake is well known as a great striper fishery. It's nationally significant. Its headwaters are all fed by cold water brook trout streams. And this year, in a great demonstration of the success of our Cold Water Land Conservation Fund, we secured protections for over 600 acres of streams such as the one you see on the right on the slide, and chapters like the Cumberland Valley chapter engaged in dozens of habitat restoration projects in the headwaters of the bay. You know, we don't only make fishing better, which is something of a tagline for us now. We actually make the places that we live better. We make the communities that we live in better. What you see on the screen is one of our dozens of youth camps that our state councils hold every year all across the country. I had the pleasure this year of attending the Pennsylvania Youth and Conservation Camp. And the fellow who's been running that for the past, I think it's 25 years now, is a guy named Rod Cross, who was nominated to be one of Field and Stream's Heroes of Conservation. That's an honor that was actually won by one of our trustees, Howard Kern, in the past. I want to share with you something that Rod said about that camp. He said, "I'm most proud of my role in running the Pennsylvania Rivers Conservation and Fly Fishing Youth Camp. A student might see just a stream. Then all of a sudden he has a net full of living things, and he learns to identify them and to tie flies to imitate them, and he catches fish. The resource starts to make sense for these kids, and they get fired up about fishing and the health of the earth." And that's what it's all about, isn't it? That's really what it's all about. And there's no better demonstration of that or example of that than the work that we have done to help restore over 50 miles of driftless area rivers in the past 7 years. This year we had 2 of our chapters in particular had great success. The Wisconsin Clearwater chapter restored 5 miles of the Buffalo River. And what's really cool about what they do in the driftless is they not only do restoration, and the restoration is significant. These rivers typically move from 200 to 300 fish per mile pre-restoration to 2,000 to 3,000 fish per mile a year after the restoration. But they not only restore these rivers, they then secure access agreements with the landowners to make them open for public fishing. And so on the Buffalo, they did 5 miles this year. But part of what's so significant about that restoration in particular was that they helped to change the way that community thinks about their rivers. Historically, they viewed them as almost waste streams, placed for farm effluent to run off. And now they view them as a healthy and vital part of a strong community. In a similar way on Bear Creek, the Aldo Leopold chapter, at least I believe it was the Aldo Leopold chapter, did 4 miles of restoration, secured 4 miles of access agreements. But what was so cool about that project was they doubled the size of their chapter by doing the project. And that's because people saw these folks out there working on the streams and said, hey, I want to be a part of that. I want to be a part of that organization that's making my community a better place. You're all familiar with the devastating storms that we've had across New England and the mid-Atlantic states over the past few years. The effect of those storms on rivers was quite damaging. Many undersized culverts blew out. We had communities in places like Vermont that were literally isolated by water. They were surrounded by water. What was equally damaging was the response to those floods. In many of those places, environmental restrictions were immediately relaxed, and then the bulldozers were immediately brought into the stream, and communities did what they've always done. They widened the stream out, and they straightened it out. essentially exacerbating flooding for downstream communities. So we started a partnership with our friends at the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Forest Service. We're inventorying 1,600 stream crossings. And we're going to take action to make sure that in the next storm, those crossings are adequate to pass significant flows. And equally significant, we're working with those communities, we're training them on how to respond to floods post-flood. And we know this will work because in 1996, when we had devastating floods in the Catskills, we worked and immediately the D9s were brought into the stream and they straightened the stream out and broadened it out. We worked with those departments of transportation and those communities up in Sullivan County on training to how to respond to post-floods. And in the aftermath of Hurricanes Irene and Sandy, the one county that didn't make the mistake of going in with heavy equipment into the rivers immediately was Sullivan County. So we're optimistic for the future. For several years, Coldstream in Maine has been the highest acquisition priority for the Forest Legacy Fund. This is an 8,500 acre parcel of working forest in Maine. It's got 8 ponds on it and 100 miles of stream. It's a really important brook trout fishery, and we were able to work with the Trust for Public Lands and other conservation organizations to secure $7.5 million to protect this parcel in perpetuity. Now, Virginia has some great trout fishing in it. I know that firsthand. It also has a lot of great warm water fishing. You know, it's a southern state. Trout aren't in all the rivers. But nonetheless, trout fishing wild trout fishing, just fishing for wild trout alone, contributes at least $40 million annually to local economies and local communities. In Mossy Creek, which is a great spring creek in Virginia, we did 5 miles of restoration. We ultimately may be able to reintroduce brook trout back into Mossy Creek. But significantly, our friends at the Mossy Creek Fly Shop, which is a great TU business supporter, said that immediately after the restoration, when the stream went from what it looks like on the left to what it looks like on the right, they noticed an appreciable increase in the number of people who were fishing the river and patronizing their store. Too often, we don't make that connection well enough. When we do restoration, it not only makes fishing better, it helps local economies. Fishing drives people to places, and those people spend money. So we need to continue to emphasize the good work that restoration does in terms of its economic benefits, as well as its ecological benefits. Maybe my favorite project of the year was on the Wenatchee River in Washington. This is truly a historic project. Historically, on the Wenatchee, they would take 5,000 acre-feet of water a year for irrigation purposes. To give you a sense of what that means, an acre-foot of water is how much water you need to cover an acre of land with a foot of water. 5,000 acre-feet a year. It was an open ditch system. We went in there and worked with the different irrigation users and the ditch company. We modernized the system. We created an on-demand system. So rather than perpetually having water flowing, they were able to call for water when they needed it. That resulted in an 86% reduction in water use. They went from 5,000 acre-feet to 680 acre-feet in the first year. 38 CFS, cubic feet per second, were returned to that stream in perpetuity. And if you don't think that's going to improve the quality of that fishery, you got something else coming. What's super cool about this project is the fact that we believe that we can export that to other communities in Washington state and other western states. Water is the biggest issue in the West right now. And the more we can do to save water by using technology to our favor, the better off we'll be. So one of the trite little sayings that I have is that TU is the patron saint of forgotten environmental causes. And one of the best examples of that is cleaning up abandoned hard rock mines. For the past 6 or 7 years, thanks in large part to the support of the Tiffany & Company Foundation, which, by the way, has probably at this point made a $2 million investment in TU, which we have leveraged 15 times over through state and federal and other private funding. But largely to their support, we've been able to clean up abandoned mines in Utah, Colorado, Montana, Washington, Nevada, and Idaho. In the past few years, we've had a new partner come on the scene, namely Freeport-McMoRan. Now, for those of you who don't know, Freeport is a major multinational mining company. They're probably the largest copper producer in the world. And their CEO called me a few years ago and he said, and he's He's been a longtime TU member, longtime CCF member. He said, I want to talk to you about two things. I want to better understand why it is you guys are so opposed to Pebble Mine, which I explained to him. And then he said, okay, I get that. Now, I want to talk to you about how we can help clean up abandoned mines in Colorado. And Freeport-McMoRan has now made it possible for us, in places like Kerber Creek, to restore 16 miles of historic habitat for Rio Grande cutthroat trout. Kerber Creek is down in the San Luis Valley, in the southwestern part of the state. We're not quite there yet, but we are close to a place where we will be able to recover a native fish that was extirpated by historic mining practices. It will be the first time this has ever been done in this country. Ten years ago, if you had said to me, Chris, we're going to strike an agreement with Denver Water that allows them to divert water from the upper Colorado over to the Front Range, and they're going to also commit to doing significant restoration and creating an adaptive management model where TU will have a seat at the table to say how that restoration will be funded and how that river is managed, I would have said that you were crazy. And that is exactly what we were able to do. 100 miles of the upper Colorado are now protected. But when I was giving this talk last year, the threat was that we were going to have an additional, right now 60% of the upper Colorado is diverted. The threat was that we were going to lose an additional 20%, which would effectively kill that river. And that is not going to happen now. In fact, our volunteers on the ground and our staff on the ground say that this agreement will actually improve the health of the upper Colorado. There is no better example, to my mind, of every aspect of this organization pulling in the same direction, from the chapter to the council to our staff in the state, than in the success that we've had this past year on the upper Colorado. Upper Lanes Creek is a tributary to the Blackfoot in Idaho, not the big Blackfoot in Montana, but the Blackfoot in Idaho. The Blackfoot is a significant Yellowstone cutthroat trout fishery historically, but that fishery is in trouble, as we'll discuss a little more later. We've been able to work with some unlikely allies here in this case. Phosphate mining companies, in particular Simplot, to restore 4 miles of Upper Lanes Creek in Idaho and reconnect it back to the Blackfoot. It's really significant that we give these fish the opportunity to move through connected systems in the face of climate change, and this project will enable us to do that. Now, when I started at TU, we used to talk about how we're a science-based organization. And what that really meant was that we would take a policy position and then we would go out and find some science to justify it. Today, we truly are a science-driven organization. One of Jack and Amy's great science team, Helen Neville, won the most prestigious award that the American Fisheries Society gives out for genetics research on some primary research that she did on the introduction of species in non-native ranges. And the point is that TU is doing groundbreaking primary research right now that's not just driving our work, it's driving the work of state and federal agencies. That's hugely significant. That's a sea change in how we operate at TU. And a great example of that is in the Owyhee system. This is such a cool river system. Historically, the Owyhee and the Jarbidge and the Bruno, they actually had salmon runs. If you can believe it, there were salmon in Nevada. And unfortunately, the construction of the 4 lower snake dams ended that. But there still persists up there this unique fish called red band trout. And what's unique about it is that it has the genetic characteristics that enable it to survive in temperatures that would be lethal for other salmonids. And so we're doing work to basically remove the other stressors in the Owyhee so that that fish can move around and persist in the face of a warming climate. And someday, society may get to a point where they say, you know what, we really don't need those 4 lower snake dams. You know, they produce 5% of the region's energy. And we should create a bypass around Hell's Canyon. And if that day ever comes, that red band trout, at least some of them, they will run to the ocean and they will return as steelhead. So for several years now, we've been putting a real emphasis on something that we call citizen science. And a great example of that is with our Pennsylvania chapters. Our Pennsylvania chapters are now monitoring over 100 watersheds. We've got over 250 volunteers who on a regular basis go out and they monitor these watersheds to look and see if there are any effects from gas development primarily occurring. And if they do detect effects, then they report them immediately and we take corrective action. That work is now expanded to Virginia and West Virginia, where the shale boom is also continuing. We've now got nearly 100 streams that are being monitored in those two states. This is really important. In 5 years from now, I would predict that every chapter around the country will be using a standardized system of monitoring their local streams, and we will, in essence, create a national database, a baseline, if you will, that will allow us to better detect the effects of changes in climate, urbanization, and energy development. 15 years ago, we started a little project up in Pennsylvania called Kerber Creek. We had this idea that let's model how we can do abandoned mine, acid mine remediation from coal and see if we can recover a brook trout population that had been lost. Well, we've done that, and this year, in fact, we received a $12 million grant from the state of Pennsylvania. I think it's the largest they've ever given out, to finish up the work in Kerber Creek. And we do, in fact, have brook trout spawning and rearing in that habitat these days. Well, we took that work and then exported it to the west branch of the Susquehanna, a river that drains 20% of the entire Commonwealth. And in the past few years, over 75 different organizations on 150 acid mine drainage projects have come to our staff for consultation and asked how they can replicate what we've done in Kerber Creek around the rest of the west branch. But the real applause line is the fact that the state or the Commonwealth was so appreciative of that work that this year the governor gave Trout Unlimited the state of Pennsylvania's Environmental Excellence and Stewardship Award. Returning back to Maine, this is a remarkable story. TU volunteers from Maine donated over 4,000 hours, 4,100 hours, surveying brook trout ponds in the state of Maine. They surveyed over 230 of these brook trout ponds, and they identified 34 that had brook trout in them that weren't known about before. And the reason that this is significant is that the state then applies additional protections to those waters that helps to keep those fish intact. Now, as you can see from the picture, this monitoring involves float tubes and fly rods, so it's not back-breaking work, but nonetheless, it's a great accomplishment. This is a real feel-good story, and Jim Broderick and my other Wyoming friends have advised me not to oversell it, but for years we have been worried about the decline of Yellowstone cutthroat trout in Yellowstone Lake. When I was in college, this was a stronghold, and that wasn't that long ago. This fishery has seen a 95% decline in about 25 years. Largely from the introduction of lake trout, which eat Yellowstone cutthroat trout. So several years ago, the councils in Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho, along with our science team, began to work with the Park Service and other partners to suppress lake trout using commercial fishing techniques. This year, we've seen increases in every age class of Yellowstone cutthroat trout. We are turning the corner here. We're not out of the woods yet, but we are turning the corner. And when we do actually round it and head home, this will be the first time in this nation's history that we have actually recovered a native fish from a threat from an invasive species. Now, this is something that is, you can almost forget about this because it's so integral to every aspect of the organization, from the smallest chapter to our large-scale project at the national level. We work in partnership with others. Everything I'm describing today was not done by just Trout Unlimited. It was done by a whole host of other colleague organizations that we work with. And a great example of that is a commitment that Farbank, that's the company that owns Sage, Reddington, and Rio, a commitment that they just made to us to help support our wild steelhead initiative to the tune of $150,000 over 3 years. And we will be in a position then to put in place the management practices and the restoration that will help to recover this cultural icon of the Northwest. And I would be remiss if I'm talking about our fishing industry partners if I didn't talk about our friends at Orvis, who have had a long time commitment to TU. You'll recall that several years ago we started something called the 1,000-Mile Campaign with them. And the idea was that we can work together and use Orvis funds and their customers' funds to help reconnect 1,000 miles of river system in 10 years. Well, over the past 3 years, we've reconnected over 338 miles, so we're on track. but equally significant, we took that $330,000 that Orvis and their customers donated to us, and we leveraged it 15 to 1.
We can actually put these fish back onto the landscape. We can literally re-knit these streams. We can recover through fairly straightforward restoration work.
It's not as sexy as fixing an eroding bank or removing a dam, but in the long run, reconnecting these tributaries can actually be more important to a river system.
I mean, having all the pieces connected is really what this comes down to, and reconnecting those pieces that have been basically severed or fragmented by culverts or other fish passage barriers. It's just one of the most efficient and effective ways that we can improve, fisheries across the country.
Some of this conservation stuff can be pretty complicated and esoteric, changing Western water law, cleaning up abandoned mines. This is real basic. You know what we're doing? We're making fishing better.
Another great example of how our chapters and partners in other conservation organizations work with us is in Washington State. This year in Washington State, after a 3-year struggle, we passed a bill in the Washington Assembly that was signed by the governor that requires that all off-road vehicles who use public lands have to have a visible ID tag on them. So you may ask, why is Chris telling us this? Well, when you have hiked up into backcountry in places like this, and you're in an area where ATVs aren't supposed to be, like a wilderness area, or an area that they're otherwise prohibited from, there is nothing more maddening than having some dude tool by you on his ATV. You now can do something about it. You can write down the number on the license plate and report him. And we all know as anglers the effect of self-policing, what great effect that has had in terms of poaching in this country from fisheries. So I think this will have a significant effect on our public lands. And we hope to take what we've learned in Washington State and apply that to other public land states as well. Several years ago, New Mexico suffered through in fact, it was the largest fire in the state's history. This is becoming increasingly common. Arizona suffered through its largest fire in the state's history. This year, Washington State suffered through the largest fire in that state's history. Unfortunately, the fire burnt through Gila trout country, and it had a significant effect on 9 of the 13 sub-watersheds where these fish persist. As soon as the fire was out, TU volunteers, working with our friends at New Mexico Department of State Fish and Game, other state agencies, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, they went right up there immediately. And they had to use mules to do it because this isn't a wilderness area where you can't use motorized vehicles. They went right up there, they shocked those streams, they grabbed as many of the Gila trout as they could and brought them down into hatcheries to hold them. Thankfully, they did that because soon thereafter, the area suffered through, of course, a 100-year flood event. And the streams were inundated with sediment and ash flows. This year, we actually began to put those fish back into those river systems, which are healing now. And if there's a silver lining in an otherwise grim story, it's this. Those fires that whacked the 9 of those 16 basins where those Gila trout persist, they also really hit other adjacent basins really hard. Basins that have rainbow and brook trout and brown trout, fish that Gila can't persist with. So we now think that we may have an opportunity through restoration and over time to actually expand the range of Gila trout by reintroducing them into those basins. We have a wonderful partnership with the grape growers and vintners and winemakers called Water to Wine, and it has a great backstory. The late Stan Griffin, a hero of Trout Unlimited, who was a longtime volunteer for us, personal friend, a hero of mine personally, he inventoried over 300 illegal water diversions from wine country over time. And it grew to the point that it was so blatant and so bad that the California State Assembly actually passed a bill to respond to it, AB 2121, which required the state to put a permitting process in place for water withdrawals in wine country. Rather than doing an end zone dance around the irrigators, we sat down with them and said, hey, listen, let's collaboratively work out a set of rules that you can live by to make sure you're getting water for your grapes, but that keep water in stream for the fish when the fish need it most. And the solution, as most of these solutions are, was quite simple. We just created off-site storage ponds that we could fill when the rivers were wet and make sure that they weren't drawing off the rivers in the winter to spray their crops to keep them from freezing when the coho and the steelhead needed them most. This partnership just won 2 significant awards this year, one from the National Fish Habitat Advisory Board and the other from the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. So this is true at every level of the organization, but I'm just going to focus on 2 chapters for a minute. We are freaking alchemists at Trout Unlimited. We turn pennies into dollars. And a great example of that is on the Jocassee River, which I probably just mispronounced, in South Carolina. This is wild and rugged country. It's more rugged than you would think could be possible in the East. And the local TU chapters there, they took a $5,000 Embrace a Stream grant. They turned it into $50,000. They leveraged it 10 times over. And then they went out and they inventoried 50 miles of this system. And what they were doing was they were looking for areas that had heritage strain, southern Appalachian brook trout, areas that had brook trout, but they were actually the progeny of New England brook trout that had been stocked, and areas that were suitable habitat for brook trout but didn't have them in, so that we can put the southern Appalachian strain brook trout back into those habitats. It's imperative that we have strongholds like this in the face of a warming climate, particularly for these fringe species like southern Appalachian brook trout. And that's exactly what the chapters in South Carolina have allowed us to do. Closer to home here on the Pecos River, I know a number of you fish this. I talked to some of you yesterday. Well, the local chapter here, what they did is they got a $4,000 Embrace a Stream grant. They turned it into $34,000 and did a large replanting of an area that had been allowing erosion and sedimentation to otherwise inundate the river. And the result, as you can see, is a happy one in terms of fisheries and fishing. So that little critter looking out at the bucket at you, that is one of 750 greenback cutthroat trout that remain in the world today. So we didn't know that until recently. There was some confusion, and we thought we had broader ranges of greenback, but actually scientists did genetic studies that determined they were actually Colorado River cutthroat. So these critters, they persist now in one river, one stream, called Bear Creek in Colorado. So our aptly named Greenback chapter, they heard about this, and they knew that the state wanted to increase their range because it's just too dangerous to have all the species in one river system, or one creek even. So they went out and they crowdsourced $10,000. They used crowdsourcing to raise 10 grand, which they think they're going to turn into 60 grand by working with great partners like Tenkara and Vetivu and Fish Pond, who also participated. And what they're doing is they're going to work with the state to identify habitat, lakes and streams that we can reintroduce these fish back into. One of the most limiting factors in the West, as I mentioned earlier, is water. And Nevada Spring Creek is a tributary to the Big Blackfoot, in this case the fabled Blackfoot of Norman McLean fame. And the hope here was if we could get water in that creek and reconnect it to the Blackfoot, we could help to recover a migratory life history form for West Slope cutthroat trout. And that's precisely what we did in Montana. We secured 8 CFS from the landowner and then it was donated to the state where it will be kept in stream in perpetuity for the benefit of the fish. The Ted Trueblood chapter is always a great chapter. They're very active in Boise. They've, for many years now, been doing restoration along the South Fork of the Boise River, which is a great wild trout fishery that flows right through town. They wanted to raise some additional funding for that, so they came up with this innovative idea of having a casting tournament. And they had 150 people come out for this casting tournament, which is significant in and of itself because they raised 10 grand. But it's equally significant because that has a very positive effect on the community. When people see TU members out there and the big Casper the Friendly Fish on a big poster board, and they see how much fun they're having, they want to become a part of that. That's how we're going to grow our membership. The Renewable Energy Bill is, this is noteworthy for 2 reasons. Number one, it demonstrates how nonpartisan we are. This is a bill that has 50 co-sponsors in the House of Representatives. 25 are Democrats and 25 are Republicans. I had the honor of testifying in support of this bill. This is a bill that we helped to develop and are promoting actively. And the reason I mentioned testifying in support of it was, it's the only time that I can remember in my 20 years in DC that the witnesses that were selected by the Democrats and the witnesses that were selected by the Republicans all testified in support of the bill. I've never seen that happen before. And what's really innovative about this is the fact that when this bill passes, and it will pass, this is a bill that will pass. We had 2 hearings this year, one in the House and one in the Senate. And if they pass an omnibus bill, this will be attached to it. When this bill passes, It will create a mitigation and restoration fund so that we can offset the effects of renewable energy development on public lands, because the time is coming when that will be prevalent. And we will now not be faced with the same situation we're faced with the 1872 mining law, where we don't have a fund to clean up abandoned mines. One of the significant challenges we have right now is restoring the basic protections of the Clean Water Act that existed for the first 30 years of that Act's existence to intermittent and ephemeral streams. That very common sense approach was thrown into question by two politically charged Supreme Court rulings in 2001 and 2006. And the EPA took action on those court rulings and responded to what the court said they needed to respond to in the form of a rulemaking that would restore those protections to 60% of the nation's stream miles. 60%. So what we did is we had to make this real for anglers. So we came up with a report that documents the importance of these intermittent and ephemeral streams to trout fishing in politically important states. And whether it was this report or something else that's just in our DNA, TU members have been phenomenal on this issue. About a month and a half ago, the 11th hour, we heard that there might be a bill or a provision in a Senate bill that would basically take away the authority of the EPA to do this most common sense thing. And TU members at every level, we had members of the board calling congressmen that they had donated to, we had council members, we had chapter leaders, we had everyone calling their members of Congress, and they fought back that effort. In the end, the Senate decided not to move forward with that bill. The reason I have this website address on the screen is that the House of Representatives is moving forward with this bill. I won't use the adjective I was going to describe, but, and it's likely to be on the floor next week. And so my plea is, don't automatically delete the action alert when you see it, asking you to take action and respond to this threat, because it is real. And we've beaten this back before, and we'll do it again. But take note of that, or see Steve Moyer or I or Keith, and we'll make sure that you can make your voice heard in this rulemaking. So I have never met an angler who isn't an optimist. By definition, we all are. And this picture here is of one of our teen summits. So 5 or 6 years ago, we had this idea that we should create a stream of engagement. We should create a model where we get kids at a young age through programs like Trout in the Classroom. We carry their education and passion for conservation through the camps. And then let's take the best of those camps, the best kids that those camps have to offer, and give them a place where they can be together in a teen summit. This year's was held in Wisconsin. And then those kids, they go out and they become ambassadors, and they create these 5 Rivers programs in their colleges and universities. We now have 60 of these around the country. 60 different colleges have 5 Rivers programs, where basically these kids fulfill their service learning requirements by working with local chapters on community projects. And they have a lot of fun, and they enjoy fishing. I want to read a quote from my friend and former employee here, Dave Peterson. Dave is a wonderful outdoor writer and probably one of the most accomplished traditional bow hunters in the country. Dave writes, "In the mentoring business, 1 + 1 equals many. Thoughtful mentoring makes more and better outdoorsmen and women. By introducing others to the skills and values of ethical hunting and fishing, you strengthen those skills and values in yourself. Students are often among the wisest teachers. We need all the young hunters and all the old mentors we can get. They, both of them, the past and the future of humanity." That's from Dave's book, Heart's Blood.
Conservation and trout fishing isn't really popular where I am. It's my job to bring it up, get it going.
I'm really passionate about conservation, and a lot of my friends are not, so I just tell them that it's a one-of-a-kind experience for me and that I wish they'd participate in it and that it makes me happy.
Headwaters is TU's program to get more youth interested in Trout Unlimited, and it goes from elementary all the way through college.
Obviously we try and improve the fly fishing, but we're also really focused on conservation and we try and make sure that our waterways will be preserved for the next generation.
It's like fun, you learn a lot, there's a lot of fish, and if you're just starting out, it's a good way to learn fly fishing and fly tying.
I've been fishing for a long time. That's the first fish that I've ever caught on a fly rod, and it was really cool.
I never thought I could catch a fish like that, so when I felt it tug, I knew I had it, and I was excited.
Just being here is an awesome experience. I'm really glad I came.
It's awesome because around me, there's not a lot of fly fishing, but when I come here, I get to interact with kids my age and like talk about fly fishing, which I don't really get to do.
If every kid would get to know this, it would be really beneficial.
When I get back, I'm going to take everything I learned at camp and I'm going to present it to our local TU chapter and see if I can get any interest in getting anyone up here to help.
Going forward, I would like to continue to stay with TU, but help in the next step of the Headwaters program, which is 5 Rivers, and start my own chapter at the University of Utah there.
I want to see TU's team members just double. I want to see it be fantastic.
It's really cool to see how it's growing and where it can go. It's all the kids from all over the country, and we're getting their ideas and hearing about their watersheds, and they're talking about, oh, this is our problem. It really helps you to realize that what you're doing is really important.
If there is one word, it would be unbelievable.
It's exciting.
Educational.
Supreme. Invigorating.
Incredible.
Empowering.
Valuable.
Amazing. Amazing. It really is amazing.
Awesome.
Wicked awesome.
It was really exciting. It was fun. It was really fun.
To come out here with people who believe in the same stuff I believe in and fish in these cool places and learn about what I love doing, it's just great.
It's one thing to take these kids and get them in a concentrated environment for a week in a camp setting or a teen summit. It's really important, don't get me wrong, but it's quite another when you can actually take them out onto a river in their community and show them what they've learned at camp on the ground. And a great example of that is on the Upper Deschutes. This project is significant for many reasons, one of which ecologically is that it's reconnected over 12 miles of stream in the past year, which, as we've talked about, is really important for fish. But the socially important reason that it's so significant is that over 375 kids this year went from local school districts in the Bend area out onto the river and learned about what we're doing and what they can do to help recover and repair that river. In a similar way, on the Rogue River in Michigan, it's a significant trout fishery in a very urbanized setting, but it's got significant stormwater runoff problems, like many of our urban basins around the country. We're working with a local community college there and the EPA to model some innovative approaches to managing stormwater runoff. The Potomac River Headwaters project, the Potomac Headwaters is the headwaters of the drinking water supply for the nation's capital. And in the past few years, working with the Fish and Wildlife Service, we have fenced over 236 miles of river. And basically what we're doing is we're trying to keep cows out of the creeks. We do that by working in partnership with farmers and landowners. And by so doing, we extend the cold water influence, which is important for brook trout, of the Monongahela National Forest further down on the private lands than it otherwise would. These projects, like the Potomac Headwaters, same with Kerber Creek or with the Kickapoo project, they're significant for the work they do in and of themselves, but they're also incubators, right? The Kickapoo spawned the Driftless Area project. The Kerber Creek spawned the West Branch of the Susquehanna. They allow us to broaden our scope and reach in these local communities that we care about and live in. And I want to close with the Veteran Service Partnership, which is a wonderful program in and of itself. Last year, over 2,500 veterans' lives were made better by TU volunteers taking them out and helping them to learn to fish and to heal through time on the water. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, we hosted a partnership project with an outfit called TAPS, the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. My brother is, in full disclosure, the chairman of their board. TAPS, what it does is it works with the families who have lost veterans in combat and basically helps them to heal. And they have these things called good grief camps. And they take them out and basically talk with them, and they allow them to be together and help them to heal. And one of the activities that they wanted to do was fly fish. So we had 32 TU volunteers from Montana and guides, many of them members of our TU business program. They donated 2 full days of guiding. The call went out from our Montana, a couple of our relevant Montana chapters, and they rounded up 32 people, including 20 or so working guides, who gave 2 days of their time to take these families out on the water. It's a great demonstration of the empathy and compassion of our organization. That's the presentation. And what I wanted to do is finish where I started at the beginning with a quote from our guide today, Frank Weisbarth. Frank writes, "Nothing is as it was. Change is the nature of things, but now we are the engine of change. We are both Noah and the flood. Consciously or unconsciously, we hold the power of life and death. The fish was for me the symbol and embodiment of what the world has lost, what it still has to lose, and what we can preserve if we choose to do so. If the trout in this tiny stream should ever cease to be, we will all be diminished, not just because the world will have become a poorer place, but because we had a choice." Conservation isn't the telling of what's been or could be lost. It is the faith in and work toward what has yet to be won. Our work is joyful. Where others see loss, we see hope and opportunity. Your presence here today, the work that you do in your chapters and in your local communities, the financial support that you provide for Trout Unlimited is a demonstration of your commitment to the values that drive this organization. When I first started at TU, I had the pleasure of meeting a wonderful woman named Marcia Woolman. Many of you know Marcia. She's a former council chair, former NLC rep, won the Mortensen Award. I said to her, "Marcia, what is it I need to know?" I was a recovering Fed. She said, "Marcia, what is it I need to know about working with volunteers?" And she said, "Chris, just say thank you." So thank you.